We are coming this morning to Augustine. We'll spend at least a week, maybe a little more on him. What I'm going to give you today will not be on the test. Everything that I covered up through yesterday, Neoplatonism, Plotinus, Manichaeism, all that, fair game for the test. Today I just want to talk a little bit about the Life of Augustine, which I think most of you are familiar with. Aren't you? Most of you had this at some point along the way. Have you ever covered the Life of Augustine? Sydney has? Okay. Anybody else? Life of Augustine? So you know, for example, he was born in the year? Sydney? No? Anybody know the century he was born? Make it easy. What century? He was born in the middle of what century? And so put a number on that. He was born in the year, when you say 3rd century, you...
Twos in there somewhere.
The twos. All right. Well, you're off by 100 years. So, I will want you to know these dates eventually, but not immediately. Augustine, of course, is known as the greatest theologian of the first millennium of the church's history, and some people would say the greatest theologian of all Christian history. I'm not taking a position on that, but he's certainly up there in maybe the top 2 or 3. He's a remarkable mind and someone who I think will always reward you when you read him. He's a favorite to the Protestants, and he's a favorite to the Catholics, but for 2 different reasons. What is it that Protestants like about Augustine and his theology, Ben?
I don't know.
You had a different question? That's fine. Go ahead.
You said he's in the top 2 or 3. Who are the other 2?
Oh, I'd say Thomas Aquinas makes the top list. Either Luther or Calvin. You know, you'd have to ask me. It'd depend on what day you ask me. You know, but certainly they would be up there. So I'd say those are the great formative thinkers. Yeah. I'm leaving out, of course, New Testament personalities. I'm leaving out Paul, for example. So, you guys high-fiving already? What'd you do? What?
Well, I was just telling him that's in my interview with you for his article, so I already knew that whole thing.
Okay, there we are. All right. Why do the Protestants like Augustine? Why is he a champion to the Protestants? Calvin quoted Augustine. Listen, Calvin quoted Augustine more than any other ancient source, more than any other source outside of the Bible itself. Calvin quoted Augustine page after page in his bibliography to Augustine, in his bibliography, you know. Why did the Protestants, why did Luther, Calvin, why did they like him so much? Sydney?
Did it have to do with his view on faith and its correlation with works? Well,
yes. You'd want to say a little bit more precisely, but certainly both those themes. Those would both be part of a broader topic, Sydney, of what? What would be the broader subject matter that both of those relate to?
Salvation.
Salvation, that's right. So Protestants love Augustine because of his robust notion of grace, especially in connection with salvation. Salvation is by grace, start to finish. We bring nada to the table. God does it all. And so Protestants generally really dug his notion of grace. You like that? It's a little throwback. However, the Catholics, who weren't so juiced up about his view of grace, were nevertheless very excited about his view of what? What was the subject that really excited the Catholics? And Sydney, once again, for $100, it is?
Well, I know that we talked about his view of the church.
Yes, that's right. You can collect $100 later. That's right. So the Catholics love Augustine on his doctrine of the church. And of course, they would say a great deal of their own vision of what the church is is connected to Augustine's various treatments of it, especially in the City of God, but in other writings as well. He's also had a huge impact in other disciplines. He's by many people regarded as one of the greatest philosophers in history. And so if you just go take philosophy, at Pagan U, you're likely to at least treat something of Augustine's views, not as a Christian, but just as a philosophical influence. He's important in psychology. He's important in, of course, apologetics and elsewhere. I want you to regard Augustine as the benchmark or the watershed, the guy who is really the last of the fathers of the church and the first of the medieval theologians. This is where you would say the early church, or the church, the patristic church, the church of the fathers ends. So he's considered a father of the church because of his early date, and yet you really don't ever hear of a father of the church after him. You know that term patristic? Have you ever heard that term, the patristic period? That's a term that simply applies to this era from about the 2nd, 3rd, part of the 4th century. It's called the period of the fathers. So you have church fathers, and some of the people we've talked about would be considered, church fathers. And Augustine is the guy that more or less terminates that. He's also, of course, the beginning of the medieval period, very early, obviously. It hasn't quite started yet, but so that's where we'll put it. All right, a little biography. He's born November, so close, November 13th.
You should plan a lesson for his birthday.
I know it. I have actually had it land on his birthday ever so often. It's too hard to just, be quite that precise. But we could almost celebrate his birthday today. We're celebrating Spencer's, a man of equal influence, I'm sure, in the history of the world. We're going to have Augustine. We're going to have, it's going to be kind of household name eventually, but right now we'll stay with Augustine. He was born in the year 354. So we would say mid-4th century, right? He was born in the region of Carthage. Carthage is located generally on what part of the map? Where would you go, Krista, to find Carthage? You would go to generally the big continent of Africa, to the north. I don't know if it's actually, Carthage is right here in the region that is modern-day Tunisia. So it's off kind of to the west there. So he's really born just almost directly south of Italy and Rome, Carthage. You're familiar with the history of Carthage. He was born of mixed parents, meaning he had a Christian mother, but a pagan father. And that created a constant warfare in the church, in the home, not the church yet, eventually the church. His mother's name was, of course,
Was Monica?
Monica, one of the most famous Christian mothers in church history. I don't know how many sermons in the history of the Christian church have been preached on Monica, the faithful praying mother who had a wayward son who caused her no end of grief. And she was one of the great examples of someone who exercised that wonderful quality that was called for a time tough love. You ever heard that expression, tough love? Well, Monica was a good example of a tough lover of her son, especially when he wasn't being such a good boy. But part of the reason that he wasn't such a good boy was because his father was constantly trying to drag him in the direction of paganism. And so mother was trying to drag him to the church while father was trying to drag him down to the public baths, if you gather my meaning there. And so he was always trying to kind of arouse in his son some interest in lascivious, fleshly, carnal interest, behavior, and to some degree he was successful. And Augustine, at least for a while, seemed to follow the paradigm set by his father more than the paradigm said by his mother. But in any event, the father, for whatever reasons, disappears from the picture. I don't know if he died or if he left. I think he died, but it's never been clear what happened there to Dad. And so Augustine winds up really with his mother and caring for her, and she for him for some time. He was brilliant. It was recognized immediately that he was an extraordinary student. And so at some expense to themselves, the parents sent him to a school called, and there he really excelled and did very well. He got the very best education. He does tell an interesting story. How many of you have read the Confessions? That's where most of this material comes from. He tells a great story about his kind of adolescent life, and there's one incident in particular that he really highlights. Ben, do you remember what that is, the highlighted event of his adolescent life?
I thought I read it. I didn't start reading.
Okay, Ben read it but did not pay attention. I have read many books that way myself. Laura, do you remember the little incident that he highlights? Megan?
I think his father told him not to touch his pear tree.
Okay, close, pretty close. Yeah, is that what you were thinking of? Krista, what do you remember about the story? Krista, what do you remember about it?
It was the neighbor's pear tree.
Yes.
He went and picked a bunch of them, but then they just went to waste.
Yes, that's exactly the story. All right. And what's odd is that when you read Augustine's account of this story, it's like he had just, murdered 3 people, and I mean, it's just he treats this stealing these pears as if it was the worst possible horrific crime you can imagine. And yet he was doing other stuff that you would think, in the greater scheme of things, was actually a lot worse. You know what I'm saying? I mean, he was going out getting drunk at night. He was engaging in kind of sexual escapades. He was doing a lot of stuff that you would say good kids shouldn't do. But it was stealing the pears that just drove him crazy, He did that a little earlier. I'm not saying he was doing it all at the same time. But like when he was about 13 years old, maybe, he steals these pears. And then later he does all this other bad stuff. But he always was really concerned about stealing the pears. Anybody know this? What do you did? Krista, you've read that. What do you think? That was such a big deal to him, stealing the pears.
He was destroying another man's livelihood.
I don't think that bothered him much. No. Anybody having a theory on that? It's a little bit kind of subtle, but in fact there was a guy. How many of you know the name Rod Serling? I've heard of Rod Serling. Nobody's heard of Rod Serling? Isn't that amazing? That's a mark of being elderly. None of you guys know who Rod Serling is. Well, Rod Serling was the creator of a very popular TV show back when I was your age, which was called The Twilight Zone. You've heard of The Twilight Zone, haven't you? Okay. And that's where that neat little music comes from. And you kind of have this strange things are happening. All right. Rod Serling was very, very popular, highly regarded, and at one point wanted to start a school for up-and-coming screenwriters for TV or for movies or whatever. And he and 2 or 3 others formed a little company, and it was like a correspondence program where you would send to him examples of your writing and they would critique it and send it back, and it was that kind of thing, And so Rod Serling and these others, to popularize their school, each of them took a classic piece of literature and critiqued it. So somebody would take maybe Theogony, or maybe the Iliad, or maybe Xenophon's March of the 10,000. But anyway, one of the pieces that they decided to critique was Augustine's Confessions. Classical piece of literature, highly regarded, and as it turns out, Rod Serling, who was no Christian, is the guy who takes on Augustine's Confessions. And his review, he just blew Augustine into the next county. He said, of all the people who have achieved fame as classical thinkers, this guy least deserves it. He is obviously an idiot. He is obviously completely messed up in his value system. And what Serling kind of lands on and analyzes is the pears. He says, look at this guy. Look at all the stuff he did. I mean, pretty bad stuff for a teenager. He would be what you would call in modern language a juvenile delinquent. He's out there stealing hubcaps, joyriding people's carriages. He's kind of running around. He's doing all his stuff. And yet, the one thing that he gets so upset about, the one thing that just bothers him, is he swipes some pears, for crying out loud. Who cares about pears? That was kind of Serling's analysis, is that this guy was obviously had a very, very screwy sense of morality, because he made that almost the worst crime he had committed. Jim, what do you think, Krista, since you seem to be the only one who remembers having read this? Can you give a response to Serling? Why do you think Augustine made such a big deal out of stealing the pears? It was not taking another man's livelihood, although that may have been a minor part of it. There was something else going, much more profound.
Did it have to do with not eating them?
That was part of it. Part of the irony was he didn't like pears. He didn't want the pears. He didn't care diddly about the pears. And when he finally did steal the pears and was stuck with all these pears he'd just stolen, he had nothing he could do with them, so he just threw them to the pigs.
Avery said.
Avery said.
He did it just for the sake of being bad?
Yeah. Do you mind if I put it this way? He just did it for the hell of it. Oh, you do mind. Okay, I take it back. Sorry. All these poor kids will feel, oh no! That's all he did. And I don't mean that just as kind of I mean it in kind of the genuine sense of it. He did it. Let me put it this way. He did it just for the pure pleasure of doing something, just because it's wrong. Huh? Ever been there? There's that kind of, we have that expression in our culture, the forbidden fruit. Something about that which is off limits makes it enticing. And the pears were off limits. Therefore, they were desirable. He didn't want them for any other reason. Now, we obviously usually mix in things that are off limits with things that are desirable. It gives them kind of an increased potency and desirability. If I want something, that's one thing. If I want something that I am not justly supposed to have, it makes it even more attractive to me. And there's 1,000 different places in life you find that to be the case. But we all have that, at least I assume, we all have this experience of realizing that is off limits, I cannot have it, and therefore it becomes a kind of fascinating item. And that's what Augustine was dealing with. And it drove him crazy to think that he was not able to control the desire for something just because it was wrong. Not because he wanted it, not for any other justification. Just the pure pleasure of doing something because it's wrong. What's wrong with us that we are that way? What is wrong with us that we have that in us? Or is it just me? I don't know. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? You're also pure-hearted. You have no idea what I'm speaking of here. Looking at me blankly. Mr. Gore, we're sorry you have that problem. Have you seen a counselor about that? Well, if I'm the only one in the room that had that problem, I'm in good company, because Augustine and I had that problem. I don't know about the rest of you. So anyway, he writes about that. And that is part of what begins his whole journey inward and his discovery of the ugliness of what resides within the soul, that you open the kind of lid of what's going on inside the human personality, and you really do open the doorway to hell. We all have that lurking inside us. It may have taken someone like Freud, much, much later, not in a Christian perspective at all, to really kind of unfold the full ugliness of that, but Augustine was already onto it. Anyway, 371 he moves to Carthage. So kind of a benchmark date, 371, Carthage. He actually was born outside of Carthage, kind of a little suburb of Carthage. Maybe, not really a suburb, maybe 20, 30 miles away. So he moves to the big city, Carthage. And there he furthered his education. He's 17 years old now. But also at this time, he just kind of went party crazy. He really got into the nightlife in Carthage. Lots of drink, lots of fun, lots of women, lots of, and he's just a teenager. He's like 17, 18 years old. And he's just kind of out of control. In 372, he took a live-in girlfriend, and she was actually with him for the next several years. But he was by no means completely faithful to her. But nevertheless, they were companions for many years. Never married her. They did have one son over the years. It was about 2 or 3 years after he arrived in Carthage that he got tied in to the Manichaeans. He despised Christianity. His mother, of course, was constantly putting pressure on him. Go to church, son. Read your Bible. Would you behave? And of course, he just is completely out of control. There's not much she can do to control him except pray for him. But she really gets upset when he joins up with the Manichaeans, because the Manichaeans were not simply a heresy. They were like a pagan religion. It'd be like you going home and telling your folks that you've decided to become Islamic. How do you think that would sell? Nicole, you go home, tell your dad, Mom, I've decided to become a dad and mom, you're going to be a Muslim, come on with the burqa on, they wouldn't be happy. they'd be feeling like something bad happened, Well, that was exactly the way Monica felt. Manichaeanism was a hostile movement. It was an enemy of the Christian church. And so basically, this is where Monica was exercising tough love. She basically kicked him out. She said, you are not going to live under my roof or anything else if you're going to be a Manichae. And so Augustine went off on his own, and for 9 years he was what's called an auditor of the Manichaean religion. He felt that Christianity was beneath his dignity. He thought the Bible was just a bunch of silly stories. He thought that anybody that had an ounce of intelligence recognized that there were more sophisticated ways to handle the meaning of life and all of that than the Bible. It was just sort of this child's play. And with his brilliant mind, he was very dismissive, very condescending, both to Monica and to the Christian faith, and that was really it. Well, that continued for a while. He finished his education. In 383, he goes to Rome. So that's kind of the next chapter. You have the first chapter where he's kind of in his hometown. Second chapter, he's in Carthage. Basically, he's Manichaean, or at least an auditor of them. 383, he goes to Rome. He's now graduated. He's now a professor of rhetoric. That's been his course of study. And it's very much the same kind of rhetoric that you study. It's Cicero, it's the classics. He was quite a master of it. Yeah, Spencer.
Did he not write anything on rhetoric ever? Because I feel like if he did, we would read.
Yeah. He wrote, the one thing that comes to mind that he wrote that I think would be responsive to your question, he wrote something on Christian teaching. That's the title of it, On Christian Teaching. And he does make quite a bit of use of Cicero and other sources and talks about what Christian training should look like. There may be other things he wrote, but that's the one that pops to mind. He showed up in Rome, and of course rhetoric at the time was a fairly widely respected discipline. I think we're doing something, and at classical schools generally, we're doing something somewhat unusual to even offer rhetoric. You won't find a course in rhetoric for example, at Shadle Park High School. You won't even find a course in rhetoric in, to my knowledge, Northwest Christian or something like that. But classical schools have tried to recover some of those classical disciplines, and rhetoric is one of them. So you go off to college and you tell people, oh yeah, I learned that in rhetoric. They're going to look at you like, in rhetoric, what? Because it's just kind of a lost art. But at the time, it was very important and highly respected discipline. And so Augustine was a master of it. Nevertheless, even though he hung out his shingle and said, here's Augustine's school in rhetoric, he got very few customers, didn't do very well, scraping along, barely making it, just not very successful at all. But he got his big break about 3 years later, in 386, when he was offered a prestigious position at the University of Milan, l'Università Milano. I want to say it a little more accurately. And he was basically offered the position. It would be comparable to being head of the department. It was really quite a break for him. He thought finally he'd made it. This was like, now he was going to get paid a decent amount. He was going to be respected for his achievements. But his time, and he was only in Milan for about a year, was absolutely, unspeakably miserable for him. When he arrived there, he had several experiences that just kind of left him hanging in midair. One was he became utterly disillusioned with Manichaeism. He was very excited because he was going to have an opportunity to talk to the reputedly greatest thinker of Manichaeism in the world, a guy by the name of Faustus. And he'd had this book like for 6 months. And he was going to get 2 hours with Faustus, who was the most brilliant Manichae in the world. And Augustine it was like one of these things where he just had a few questions. He liked the Manichae religion. He thought really they were on to the real insights about what explains things, but he just had a few little loose ends he wanted to tie up. And so he was looking forward to sitting down with this guy who was reputed to be the most amazing Manichaean intellect in the world, and he looked forward with great excitement, and finally the day came, and he went in and sat down with Faustus, and he was able to have some conversation with him, and within about 15 minutes, Augustine realized, this guy's a nitwit, And Augustine kept asking questions for which the guy had no answer. I mean, he didn't have any answers. He didn't even get the question. It's like Augustine was going, whoa, wait a minute. You're the one I've been waiting all this time to talk to who's going to straighten it out. And he realized that the loose ends that he had were not just loose ends, they were a noose, and that Faustus was continuing to kind of hang himself because he just couldn't respond to the questions. I mean, for example, one of the questions he wanted to kind of tie up, simple enough. The Manichaees were dualistic, right? You remember that? And the two sides of the dualism were what? What's one side here, Josiah? One side would be
Good.
the good. And the other side would be, here, Nicole?
Evil.
Thank you. And what immediately presents itself about that distinction between two ultimate metaphysical powers, one called good and one called evil. What immediately pops to your mind is a philosophical problem with respect to that particular understanding of how things work. What's the problem there? It's so obvious, you may not see it. But when I say it, you go, oh, yeah. What do you think, Spencer?
Maybe who wins? I don't know.
Well, it in some ways is a who wins question, but it's not that, because nobody wins in a dualism. What on the face of it, as soon as we put it this way, is screaming at you as a problem with a metaphysical dualism like this. Megan?
That evil is not equal to good.
Yeah, well, maybe so, maybe not. Well, you may be onto it. Anybody know what I'm after here? This was just Augustine's first question. This was supposed to be the easy question. Ben?
Was it maybe what makes one better than the other?
Yeah. Don't we look at good and say good, because we call it good, is better than evil because we call it evil, right? I mean, these are not just two neutral forces. One we call good, one we call evil. And immediately we've made a value judgment about them. But who in the world is to say which one is which if those are the two forces? By what standard are we saying, oh, that's the good one and that's the bad one? Because if there's some standard by which those are being measured, then those cease to be ultimate. You've got to have something up there that's the standard by which you've made that judgment. But there is nothing up there if these are the ultimate forces. You see the problem? And Augustine thought, well, that's kind of an easy question. I mean, hey, there's got to be a pretty simple answer to that one, because that's so obvious. As soon as you talk about it, you see that problem. And he raises that to Faustus, and Faustus looks at him like, the proverbial deer caught in the headlight of the oncoming train. It's like, and then Augustine starts asking other questions that are more difficult than that one. And the guy just kind of melts down right in front of his eyes. And Augustine walked away deeply, deeply shaken, because he had kind of put his eggs in that basket. He'd been so disparaging of the Christian faith, so silly, doesn't have answers. Obviously the Manichees have figured it out, and now he begins to realize the Manichees are even worse off than the Christians. And he didn't like the Christians anyway. You see. Now, that's one little prop that knocks out from under him, early in his time in Milan. He also fell very ill. We don't know exactly what he had. It's hard to diagnose it from 1,500 years distance. But he was really sick like he thought he might die. And so that was upsetting to him, of course. He was, while he was having these struggles with health and his faith struggles, he was also deeply upset with himself, because he could not control his physical passions. He was what you might call, in modern parlance, a kind of sexual addict. There are people who are addicted to various things. You can be addicted to drugs, you can be addicted to alcohol, you can be addicted to pornography. Many men are. And it's a miserable and pathetic place to find yourself. And while they didn't quite have the internet and internet pornography then, like we might now, nevertheless, that was kind of what was going on. He could not control his sexual desires. And he had gotten to the point where he felt like it was so pathetic. There was a time when it was fun. That's great, go out and have a party and just kind of cut loose all restraint in my life morally. There was a time when that seemed like, Now it's a miserable form of imprisonment when you cannot stop doing it. When you can't stop thinking about it. When you're just, obsessed by it. And it was basically paralyzing him. And then he looked at people in this Christian movement who seemed to have such self-possession, who seemed to be able to just rise above that and not be burdened by it, as the whole culture seemed to be taken over by it. And he wondered, how come? How come these people? Augustine was, 10,000 times smarter than the average Christian he would meet, and yet that person had more self-discipline, self-regulation than Augustine. All that IQ didn't do him a bit of good when it came to his fundamental passions. And it bothered him like crazy, that he couldn't get that under control. He split up with his long-term girlfriend. That upset him. And just, it was life, all of life was just sort of giving him grief. Well, it was in the context of this. He tells, by the way, this whole story in the Confessions. And by the way, that's good reading. In spite of Serling's, critique of it, it's actually pretty good reading for Christians. So if you ever have a chance, go out to the lake, summer, just want some nice reading out on the dock with the sun shining, read the Confessions. It'll bring you back to reality. But anyway, he starts attending a church in Milan where one of the most famous preachers in the ancient world was preaching every Sunday. A guy by the name of, anybody know who was the famous preacher who was preaching in the biggest church in Milan and was a famous orator, and his name was Jacob?
Ambrose?
Ambrose is correct. Is that what you're going to say, Josiah? Ambrose, who was brilliant. If there had never been an Augustine, we'd probably be having a lecture today on Ambrose. But when sometimes the master is totally, exceeded by his student, then the master slides into the background and the student gets all the credit. So I'm sure hundreds of years from now they would be talking about Gore. But one of you is going to turn out to be, a great flaming genius, and Gore is going to be left in the dust. And I don't know who it's going to be. One of you guys. Yeah, maybe it's Ansett. I don't know. Could be, who knows. Same thing, by the way, happened with a guy named Albertus Magnus, he was a brilliant theologian in church history, but he was totally eclipsed by his most famous student, so we rarely hear of Albertus Magnus because his student took over, and that student's name was, you know this one, Josiah? Who was the just unbelievably famous student, brilliant student of Albertus Magnus? Pardon me? Not Gore, no, it wasn't Gore. Okay, this is a side point, it was Thomas Aquinas. Anyway, Augustine goes, he sits at the feet, well, I wouldn't say sit, he goes to the church services where Ambrose was preaching. He doesn't go because he's very interested in the Christian faith, but he does go because he's very impressed with Ambrose's rhetorical style. Ambrose was a brilliant preacher, a brilliant public speaker, brilliant master of rhetoric, and so really Augustine just went to take notes, on his skill and to get some kind of ideas about how to speak effectively. But you know how it is. He starts sitting under the preaching of the gospel, and pretty soon the gospel is weaseling its way into his conscience and making him ever more miserable. And in the context of all of that, he meets with Ambrose several times. Ambrose recommends to him, get this, Ambrose recommends to him that to straighten out some of his confusions and his ideas that were upsetting to him about the nature of good and the nature of evil, where he'd been totally disappointed by the Manichaeans, maybe, Ambrose says, you ought to read Plotinus. And so here's Ambrose, a Christian theologian, recommending a pagan author to help Augustine straighten out his understanding of the nature of evil. But Ambrose felt that even though Plotinus was no Christian, philosophically he had done a more profound treatment of the nature of evil than anybody else out there running around loose, and that would actually help Augustine think it through. And of course, for Plotinus, evil depends on the good. Plotinus doesn't have this problem, because the good is rooted in the one. And evil is only able to be defined with reference to the good. Without the good, there wouldn't be the evil. You see, there's no dualism there. And Ambrose felt that is a more Christian answer to the problem than, certainly the Manichaeans had come up with. And Augustine uses that. And eventually in his own theology, you see a little bit of that Neoplatonism sneaking in. Yeah.
Can I hand out my brownies?
Yes. Okay, we're 10 minutes out, and that is the traditional time in which the brownies are distributed. This is called the sacrament of the distribution of the brownies. So, but while Spencer is doing this, let me relate to you the concluding little story here, which some of you know, of the conversion of Augustine. Anybody know that story? When does it happen? How does it happen? Do you read me? Anybody out there? See, the brownies take over. I've seen it many times. And I just become a TV set. I'm not a background noise. Nobody's paying attention. You have volume down. Change the channel. Oh, it doesn't change. What's the story of the conversion of Augustine? Anybody know that story? Anybody? Josiah?
I think he was in some type of garden.
Yes, he was in a garden. Excellent.
There was a book,
Yes.
Bible,
Yes.
and he flipped it open.
Yes.
I think it landed somewhere in Romans.
Yes. That's very good.
So, and he read, I can't remember what the passage
Okay.
was. It's kind of the whole critical Romans thing.
Okay,
I
that's
go
right.
that far.
Very good. Okay, Josiah's substantially there. Please get this.
Oh my God.
Augustine is in this kind of tormented state emotionally, and he hears a kid on the other side of a fence. He can't see the kid, can't tell if it's a boy or a girl, but the kid is singing a little song.
Wait, the kid,
The kid is singing a song.
but you said he was in a tormented state. Oh, yeah.
He's in a garden, but he's weeping. Okay? I mean, he's tormented, but he's in a garden, you know. So,
Okay.
and he hears this kid on the other side of the fence singing, and the words that you always hear about this is "telelege, telelege." Yeah, I'll have about 4 of those. You can put them on my which means, I guess, take it and read, take it and read. So then Josiah's story picks up. Augustine decided that was actually God's speaking to him in the voice of a child, and that what he should immediately do is go grab that Bible, flip it open randomly. This is not an approved Bible study method. You did not learn this in hermeneutics. He should go randomly, open his Bible, drop his finger on the first verse that comes to his sight, bang like that, just kind of throwing darts at the Bible to read what it hits. And so that's what he does. And the verse that he reads is, thank you for bringing your Bible to class. This is a Bible, right? Here it is. So here's the verse that Augustine reads. It's Romans chapter 13, verse 13. Romans 13:13. Quote, "Let us walk properly as in the day, not in revelry and drunkenness, not in lewdness and lust, not in strife and envy." And basically, Augustine felt like those 6 adjectives all described him. Revelry and drunkenness, lewdness and lust, strife and envy. He felt like that was the story of his life. And yet, somehow, it was reading that text that seems to have been the moment that he was liberated from all those things. He was baptized, much to his mother's joy, the following Easter. Usually they do all the baptisms on Easter Sunday. So in 387 he was baptized. Catholics say he became a Christian on Easter Sunday 387. Protestants say he became a Christian when he was in a garden and read that text from the Scripture. So depending on whether you're a Protestant or a Catholic here, you can take your pick as to your view of his moment of true conversion. But, from there he leaves his job in Milan. He goes back to Carthage. He wants to live alone. He kind of enters into a little private group with some other young men, and they just devote themselves to what amounts to a kind of, you might say, a little sub-society of studying the Scriptures. And by about 5 years later, his reputation had become so well known that he was virtually forced into the priesthood and eventually forced into being the bishop of a little seaport town in North Africa called, what's this we hear of, Augustine of, what's the city? Hippo. Who said that? You said that. Thank you, Kelly. Hippo, Hippo. He spent the next 35 years of his life there. He died in 430. During those years, He maintained just an incredible production of writings and speaking, serving the church as a practical matter as well as a great theologian. And starting next Monday, we will start talking about his thought and his contribution in the history of the church.